Hello and welcome to the Pipeliner CRM webinar series. Today we're pleased to have Andy Rudin to talk about sales, zombies, and revenue risk. Oh my! We'll learn all about uncertainty and how to use it to our advantage. So with us, Andy is a high-achieving business development executive with over 30 years of experience creating and implementing successful revenue growth strategies. He works with everybody from small B2B startups all the way up to global enterprises. He's also a featured columnist on Customer Think, where his monthly column, Navigating Revenue Uncertainty, is published. His company, Contrary Domino, specializes in sales strategy development and implementation, especially for new account acquisition, account retention, revenue growth, and reclaiming lost accounts. So without further ado, Andy, welcome. Take it away.
Well, thanks, Eric, and thanks to Pipeliner for inviting me to participate today, and especially thanks to all of you for your time and participation in this program. Now, I'm excited to be here delving into this topic because this workshop brings together learnings that I've compiled over the past several years and shares some emerging tools and techniques developed to help companies better understand uncertainty and risk and how to use it for revenue planning. Now, just the words uncertainty and risk can sound daunting, but part of my aim today is to demystify this topic and to help people recognize not only that risk and uncertainty can be understood and approached, but how effective risk management gives companies a crucial advantage over competitors that ignore it, allowing themselves to be blindsided by situations that could have been anticipated, managed, or mitigated. Now, that misfortune has certainly happened to me, and I've compiled a long list of stories, which I won't share here in the interest of time. So, over the next 45 minutes, I will work hard to make sure this program is valuable for you and hopefully make it a little entertaining too. I also look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments. So let's jump right in. There are many stats about sales performance, and we depend on them to understand and really to know what's working and what's not working. Now, most of you are probably well aware of the numbers, and I won't dwell on endless facts and studies, except this one, which hits to the core of the problem I am covering today. In 2013, about 58% of salespeople achieve quota or plan. Now, why is that? Well, the answer is in that vertical arrow that you see on the right. It's risk, and that's what's come home to roost. And here are just a few of them: customer churn, mergers, technical needs, changing buyer needs, buyer objections, acquisitions of companies, social media campaigns that are uncertain or with unclear outcomes. So risk can be mighty hard to describe, but Donald Rumsfeld famously took a crack at it when he was asked about the links between the government of Iraq and terrorist organizations. And here's what he said: there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. Now, later on, you can parse out that wisdom because there's a lot of meat in what he said. But in the meantime, let's go with a more succinct way of explaining it. And that is, Mr. Ackerman, if you want a guarantee, then buy a toaster. Because in selling, as we know well, there are few guarantees. So what we will cover today is illustrating a simple risk example, describing risk in a sales context, outlining a 6-step process for identifying revenue risk, giving actionable ways to manage the risk, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So by the end of this program, you can expect to have a process for exposing your key revenue risks, an understanding of the major revenue risks that many companies face, and then a framework for managing them. So earlier this year, John Golden of Pipeliner talked about risk in his program, Minimizing Risk in Your 2015 Sales Process. And today we're going to build on his ideas. Dealing with revenue risks involves the choice of minimizing risks, but later in the presentation, we'll discuss other options you need for actually managing them. So I don't know if you can see the polling question, but Eric, I wanted to find out, is there, can you bring that up on your screen or for the group?
It's already up for the group, so everyone go ahead and take a minute to select one of the following. Basically, we're asking how confident are you in achieving your annual quota or goals in 2015? So of the 4 options, we've got very confident to not confident, and the middle 2, confident or not sure. We'll leave that up for just a moment longer and collect the results. So what do you think, Andy? What do most people usually reply when this poll, when you've done this in the past? Or where do you expect most of the answers to be?
Yeah, it really varies. I find very few people are supremely confident, which would be the A response, and most people are somewhere in the middle. I think in some industries, especially ones where they have had a lot of recent downturns or in slow growth markets, you'll find that there's not a lot of confidence about achieving the revenue goal. So it's
fascinating.
Really toward the bottom.
Well, we've got the results back in, and everybody is clustered in the middle. So nobody is very confident, and nobody is unconfident. So there we go.
Well, that's interesting because it suggests that there is a feeling or an understanding that uncertainty is out there, and now we'll be exploring how that comes into play. So we'll start out with a very common example, a risk challenge that is familiar to most of you, and I'm going to cover this very quickly so we can get into the selling scenarios. Imagine that you have a colleague who has never traveled to your city and she is making plans to visit, and she asks you, about how long does it take to get from your city center to the departure gate at your closest international airport? And think about which answer you would give. You can keep it in mind or you can just jot it down. Now, since I live just outside the D.C. area in Virginia, I'll use D.C. to Dulles to illustrate this example. And if you live in this area or if you have ever experienced commuting here, you already know that answering this question is difficult without first qualifying the estimate. Oh, and one more thing, I should add that this colleague is an analytic type who really likes accurate numbers. So I do some quick research online, and this website tells me to allow about 40 minutes. Since I'm not really sure, I don't have information about how she wants to get to the airport or even when she has plans to travel. So I do some additional checking and I find some estimates on the Metro website. This one for 1 hour and 10 minutes, may be hard for some of you to see, but it's one itinerary. And then the second one here for 1 hour and 31 minutes. Now these numbers are valuable to me because they help me build the universe of possible answers that I can offer to my colleague. My next step is to build a table of information for her to use. If she drives her personal vehicle and she's terribly unlucky with traffic, her journey from downtown to her gate at Dulles could require as much as 3 hours. And if everything goes swimmingly, she can zip out to the boarding area in as little as 45 minutes. It's a little shorter for taxi because she doesn't have to deal with parking, and a little longer if she takes Metro Rail and the combination of Metro Rail and the bus. I'm trying to give her a number to use for planning since she asked me about how long will it take to get to her gate. So I average the worst case and best case values and add a column titled average. But I quickly spot a problem. It doesn't take an average of 1 hour 52 minutes to get from DC to Dulles. It's less. It's really closer to 60 minutes. The same issue occurs for the taxi. So this exposes what's called the flaw of averages, and many people step into this interpretive trap, particularly in sales. So I ditch averages and I offer a more nuanced value called most likely, based on my knowledge of each mode of transportation. Now that's really more like it. We can see the worst case possibility, the best case, and what to expect most of the time. And again, note that that is not necessarily the numerical or the mean between the worst case and the best case. So how long will it take to get from downtown DC to Dulles? If you consider all of my estimates, they cover a wide range, about 2.5 hours. Now, if you're a student planning to hang out in DC for a few months, that uncertainty is probably acceptable. You'd thank me for my help, and you'd show up this summer with your frame backpack and guitar. But if you're a business traveler who has an appointment in a different city that same afternoon, that range won't cut it, which brings up an important point about uncertainty. What's acceptable depends on the context of the problem you're solving. So when I provide that range, what am I considering? Well, here are some factors. First, the mode of transportation that my colleague intends to use. What hour of the day she's planning on traveling, whether it's in rush hour or off-peak times. Whether there's an accident or other mishap out on the Beltway. What the prevailing weather conditions are or might be, whether there's snow on the ground. What day of the week it is. Whether we have an inauguration or a major festival like the 4th of July. Whether there's road work on the Beltway, whether her car has a flat tire or the train breaks down, and how long the line is at security. So now, to wrap this up, I'll give a quick trio of recommendations for my colleague. If she wants the absolute fastest way to the airport, she should definitely take the cab or Uber. Taking her car is convenient, but it's also the riskiest because the range is so volatile. And mainly, if she wants to play things safe and wants a predictably dependable way to get to her gate, then taking Metro is the best bet. Now, extending these considerations into sales is easy since we're all used to working with it through funnels, forecasts, and pipelines, which should look familiar to you on the screen. All of them represent risk and uncertainty. And the challenge is how to identify and quantify uncertainty and clarify our understanding so that uncertainty isn't just a messy blob or just a combination of things that are events that occur, or even worse, something that shows up as a crater in a past quarterly revenue chart. So this picture should be familiar to all of you. It's a traditional sales funnel, and as we know, not everything that goes in at the top, in this case leads, results in a purchase at the bottom of the funnel. And that taper is risk. Now the comparison funnel, really a cylinder, which I'm showing here, is the holy grail of marketing. It's the nirvana that we all strive for but find so hard to achieve. It's a straight sales funnel, a risk-free funnel. And clearly every lead in this representation, every lead that goes in at the top results in a sale. And sure, there's some steps along the way, but nothing leaks out of the funnel. Now, if that were the case, there'd be no such thing as performance gaps, and we could all take our afternoons off, or depending on your lifestyle, take the morning off. Which brings us to our next polling question.
And we'll go ahead and throw that up there for the audience. But we're basically asking, what's the primary reason that prospects leave your sales funnel? So we're trying to ascertain, whether there's a poor fit, not enough money, the old budget hobgoblin, lost to a competitor, the prospect's priorities change, or an unanticipated event or unknown reason, which is, I'll be interested to see if this is more common than most people give credit for. Andy, what do you think is going to be the leading response here?
Well, I'll wait a few more seconds for some responses to come in. When I've worked with companies in the commercial market, the primary one is the first one that I've listed, and that is poor fit. Unfortunately, that's one of the toughest challenges in early stage lead qualification, and so many salespeople, myself included, have gone way down the process only to discover later on that there's a poor fit for the solution. And but the other ones are fairly prevalent as well, and so I haven't found that these are beyond the first one, that these are clustered in any one area.
So we're seeing that prospects' priorities changing is the biggest risk factor, or the primary reason that prospects are leaving the sales funnel. Interesting.
Okay, so we'll discuss that coming up as we talk about what artifacts to uncover about our selling risk. So, really thinking about risk, it's it's not always easy, and it can create some what I call culture clashes within business development organizations. So many managers say something like, "Go take that hill," to spur on their team, and on the other extreme, we hear this, "Hey," and then stuff happens. The problem is you can't take actions about any of the risks that you face without knowing what they are. So here's the key to a happy medium, is to acknowledge that there are specific things that are uncertain. So it's fair to say changing customer needs or changing needs are an uncertainty, and then that acknowledgement becomes a very important first step in determining what to do about managing that. And there are ways to manage that. So what I encourage every company to do is, rather than to sweep uncertainty under the rug, put it to work. And so this is, I read this statement on a bumper sticker not too long ago. If you're prepared for flying irradiated zombies that can swim, then you're prepared for anything. I don't know the driver's motivation for wanting to broadcast that message, but be assured I'm not recommending to anyone here to maintain that level of paranoia. And on the other hand, isn't supreme confidence a great feeling to have? Now, effective risk management is really more practical. It's about knowing what risks you face, prioritizing them, and then having the will to address them. And when you do that, your all-important optimism will be much more credible, because people will know it's grounded in reality. So there are 6 steps I recommend to clients, and I will cover in this session each one of them. The first one shouldn't be difficult, because most companies already do this, and that is start out with a deterministic statement. And so what that looks like for a lot of companies is something structured like this. It starts out with R, and then you fill in the name of your goal for whatever time frame you're talking about, month, quarter, year, is this particular quantity. And so this translates to a declaration that should be familiar to everyone on this call. You can fill in with your own number, but our revenue goal for fiscal year 2016 is $35 million. So step 2 is to identify areas of concern. What jeopardizes the outcome? What issues or challenges could confront you or your team in your effort to go take that hill? Now, for some of you that are new to this, you may be looking for a good starting point, and if you're familiar with John's presentation from a month or two back, his 4 components for an effective sales process constitute, it's a very good place to start, because he outlined some activities that do have risk inherent in them, and those 4 components offer a really good template for identifying opportunities to address. Which brings us to our third and final polling question.
And we'll throw this up on the screen for everyone to participate here. But basically what we're asking is, which of the following has the most significant impact on your revenue results? So, starting at the top, the number of qualified leads received by sales, pure volume, the number of sales engagements that entered the proposal phase, the average value per sales transaction, the length of the buying cycle, or if you're just not sure, kind of opt out. So what do you think here, Andy? What are we going to see as the leading response amongst this cohort?
Well, lead gen is always an overarching concern, and so that usually appears number 1, 2, or 3 on the responses that I get. Some of these other ones are a little more subtle, but they've also been identified as important. So certainly the number of sales engagements that even get to the proposal stage is crucial. So you can have all the leads you want, but if they're not, if you're not documenting what your the terms are of your offer and the pricing, then you're you're basically not getting to play in the sandbox, and so that can factor big. And since I work in the DC area, the buying cycle time can be exceedingly problematic, since many of the revenue opportunities are based in government accounts, and these can go a year or even far longer than that. And that has certainly been challenging for a lot of the companies in this area.
Well, how about this? We get the number of sales engagement that enter the proposal phase is the overwhelming #1 answer. So we'll kick it back to the presentation here, but that's a interesting discovery amongst this webinar group.
Okay, fantastic thing to put up on our in our whiteboard exercise here. So really, identifying areas of concern is a whiteboard exercise, and when you do this, when you go over what are you most concerned about, it's very, very valuable to bring your entire business development team into the room and put your goal on the whiteboard and start asking, well, what about, and write down what you learn. Pretty soon, you'll get a clearer picture of your risks, and I recommend to people they write down everything and not try to vet things on the spot. It can get to be pretty tedious, and also you really want to get the artifacts out. And in the next step, you can start to pare some things back. Some of what you learn from your team will mirror what you've just shared out here, that getting to the proposal stage is important, and some people will bring up things that possibly you never thought of before. So some of those are, we might not get enough leads, our product might not be available when customers require it, which is a supply chain challenge, might not be able to sell at our list price, so if you consistently have to discount, that can affect. The sales team might not be able to engage with prospects, is often a big one. If you can't even engage in a conversation, whether it's face-to-face or via social media, then things aren't going to go well in the sales process. The average proposal value might be too low. You may not be aiming high enough as far as your total revenue per transaction. The exchange rate for exports might not be favorable. Too few opportunities might reach the proposal stage. You certainly reflected that. And then something that a lot of people don't pay enough attention to, but we've seen it happen many times, our brand might take a bad hit if an employee does something stupid on social media. So companies need to pay attention to all of those things. Now, this step may seem uncomfortable for some people, and I understand that, because we can struggle with this process because we don't want to undermine anyone's can-do attitude, and we especially don't want to cast doubt on the idea or the fact that we can win. So hard as it might be to bubble up these artifacts, it doesn't mean that anyone sitting in that room has to be any less rabid or any less tenacious or goal-focused. And done right, people should realize, need to understand, this is not the same thing as whining. This is not the same thing as lame excuses. And certainly the people who are discussing this shouldn't be labeled not a team player, because successful revenue achievement means situational awareness, and this is an indispensable step for having it. So the third step is prioritizing those areas of concern. So after fleshing out what's concerning for your goal, whatever it is, you can now prioritize them by ranking them from most serious to least. So I've, in the example company that I've put together here, one way to rank this might be first, lead flow. The sales team might not be able to engage with prospects. Too few opportunities might reach the proposal stage, and the average proposal value might be too low. So in this case, we could reorder or reorganize those, but I think that you get the idea. Now this next step can be a little bit more challenging. Typically, every one of these concerns has more than one activity related to it, and that brings us to step 4, which is to take a view on a related process. So I'll just step you through how this works. It can be organized like this, and to simplify the example, I've used only one related process, but in practice, most often there are multiple related processes for any given concern. So, for example, we might not get enough leads. The related process is how many leads or how many qualified leads are sent to sales from marketing. The sales team might not be able to engage with prospects. Well, the related process is, well, how many face-to-face appointments does the sales force actually get? Too few opportunities might read the proposal stage. Well, the metric or the measurement for that, the related process would be, well, how many proposals are being generated? And then finally, average proposal value might be too low. Well, that's the actual average total value per proposal. Very similar to the airport example, we have to come up with the worst case, most likely, and best case values for these processes. And remember, be aware when you use averages for most likely, because they don't always apply, and using them can cause misleading results if you move to more sophisticated probability analysis, which I'm going to touch on briefly in a moment. But I'll step you through how to develop the worst case, most likely, and best case. So in this example, revenue goal of 35 million, I've estimated a range of 22 million, which may seem large, but hang in there with me. It goes from 18 million in sales on the low side if the company has a poor year to 40 million if its revenue engine is hitting on all 8 cylinders and the turbocharger kicks in and everything's working really well. But based on some assumptions that I hope are solid, I think that 32 million will be the most likely outcome, which I recognize is 3 million shy of plan. And that's an issue that clearly needs to be addressed with senior management as we develop strategies and tactics for managing the risk and for ensuring that actual revenue achieved matches the company's financial goals. And so similarly, we can project values for the related processes. And this example uses annualized figures, and as you can see in the upper left of that chart, the sales force N equals 40, which is why the values are within this range. So in this estimate, I'm saying the worst case for number of qualified leads received from marketing is 3,600. The most likely is 4,000. Best case is 6,000. And then note the most likely value is not, again, not the average. It's something I've put some judgment into. Similarly, for the number of face-to-face appointments held, worst case is just a little bit over 1,900, 4,800 for the most likely, 5,760 for the best, and so on and so forth. So you get the idea there. The next and the last step is to test the validity of the extremes for each estimate. And that means explaining why the worst case can't go any lower and why the best case can't go any higher. And this is a very important step because it helps managers understand volatility. And in general, variables with lower volatility are considered less risky, and the opposite is true for variables with higher volatility. So the more that's understood about the range of possible outcomes that you could gain or have, the better we can figure out what needs to be tightened up in order to manage risk. So here, just to show how these numbers can be developed, I estimated $18 million worst case because this is what my example company would achieve by doing little more than keeping up their website and processing sales transactions. This company could make this revenue even if every top producer suddenly left on sabbatical and left a skeleton crew of inexperienced newbie reps. And for the best case on the right, the high value in this case assumes that the manufacturing plant, if it's a material item that's being sold, the manufacturing plant would be at full capacity and would be selling its full production to achieve $40 million. So that's how I've developed that range. And then the most likely value, is we'll see in a moment, is a crucial part for the statistical analysis. And so on. I've made similar explanations for each value on the chart. We're just taking the processes and explaining why the worst case can't go any lower, why the best case can't go any higher. So you get the idea. The worst and best values selected must have solid reasons behind them, or none of these numbers will be meaningful for planning. Now, you can imagine how revenue results might change if the worst case, say, average number of proposals generated, could be increased by 1,000 over a 1-year period. Now the question is, well, how much improvement? And the answer for that requires statistical analysis, which goes beyond the scope of today's program. But I'll give you a flavor for what I'm talking about here. When you tackle revenue uncertainty in the methodical way I've described, you have the opportunity to use powerful analytical tools for measuring the impact of the changes that you're considering. So they can be from simple things like the revenue uptick you might achieve from increasing the number of prospect opportunities brought to proposal stage, which you pointed out. We can actually measure what the likely impact is of that, to much more complicated problems like the revenue impact of pending legislation or the effects of mergers and divestitures in your market space. So hang in there with me. I've limited the geeky stuff to just this one slide. If you look on the left, these 3 curves here represent probability distributions, and the key thing is you can see there's a tail on 2 of these, and the one in red looks more like a normal distribution, and this is the reason why we work with most likely rather than averages. So we can take uncertain variables like the ones I showed, we fit a distribution curve, and we come up with what we have on the left, and then in the center we can produce pro forma calculations, and we can literally iterate thousands of different combinations of these variables. And in the histograms that you see on the right, we can produce outcomes of interest, which would include expected revenue, unit sales volume, net profit, just about anything that you would want to have. We call it a output of interest. Now, the decisions that managers make regarding risks is really where the rubber meets the road. So the first question to ask is, how likely is it that the risk will occur? Second, if the risk occurs, what is the magnitude or the impact of the result? What is the range of possibilities? In other words, what is the volatility of this particular variable? Can the risk be eliminated or reduced? In other words, is it preventable or controllable in the first place? Can the risk recur, and if so, with what frequency? And finally, does the change in one condition cause a corresponding change in another? This is a very important question to ask because there are many variables that move in tandem. For example, if your raw material costs increase, it's very likely that your selling price is going to have to increase as well. And so we look for those correlations and connections so that we can more effectively model what the outcomes are. Now, just as with the airport example, the risk characteristics are only meaningful within some context. So it's impossible to say whether a risk itself is good or bad. It's just a risk. And you can't really decide what to do with it until you know its context. Now, this confusion is the source of really a lot of sales performance problems that I see. Some companies knowingly take on revenue risks that they can't afford, or they really don't have the capacity to absorb them. Other companies are really clueless about the risks they have in the first place, and amazingly, some are just much too conservative, and they don't take on enough risk. So I hear things like, well, we're just sitting tight for right now, waiting it out to see what the economy does. And if you've been in sales for a while, you've probably heard this, and you've probably heard it more than once. So what I recommend companies to do starting out is to develop what's called a heat map and use your risks that have the greatest volatility. This is even before you have to or work on any high-level statistical analysis, do something that's called a heat map. And so risks that are high likelihood and high impact, that is, they will probably happen, and when they do, there's going to be a major effect on results, those risks are prime candidates to be managed. And then the opposite is true for low likelihood and low impact. And the ones that are mixed, Well, that really depends. So you should continue to monitor them and address them as the need presents itself. Now, with risk, you have choices about what to do, and please bear in mind that the items I'm about to show you here, they're not ranked in order of importance or effectiveness. They're just a list of choices. And the first choice is to accept the risk. This is always a risk strategy. It's something you have to recognize. In one, and it may seem painfully obvious, but it's certainly something that companies have to consider. If you have to accept the risk that a prospect may not buy, and if you can't accept that risk, then that's a major problem, because you shouldn't be in sales, because we know that that's always a situation we're going to encounter. The second strategy is to eliminate the risk, and that is very hard to do. And I came up with an example where it's used very commonly, that companies, or that you may be familiar with, but companies that want to eliminate the risk of bad debt will accept cash only. You can reduce the risk, and this is very important when you have high volatility, high customer churn. You've got ethical risks that can be very costly to a company and its brand, and you have risk of fraud. You can share the risk, which is a common reason that companies engage in outsourcing and channel sales. And you can also transfer it, which is another strategy, especially for, again, why companies develop outsourcing relationships and what they look to their channel partners for. And some people, frankly, take on full commission salespeople to transfer the risk, the selling risk, from the company to the salesperson. And the last one is kind of overlooked, but it's a very important risk management strategy. You can certainly choose to add or increase your risk. And whenever you introduce a new product line, enter a new market, you are managing or possibly reducing some risk, but you're also assuming new ones. And this certainly occurs when you're working with government accounts that have very, very long sales cycles. They have very high revenue potential, but they also are not for every company, because it takes so long to carry, or it's very costly to carry the revenue opportunity. Now, there are several planning pitfalls, and when you're addressing uncertainty and risk, I've experienced some really common ones, and have actually committed many of these myself. So see if any of these quotes I'm about to read ring a bell. And now that you have the perspective of how numbers are used in an analytical way or analytical framework, think about how these mistakes can distort planning. First is anchoring. Our number is based on the estimate that we got back in 2013. Bias and wishful thinking. I really, really want this result, so that's the one I'm going to forecast. Not enough information. Well, you know, we didn't really consider the possibility of regulatory impact when we came up with our sales plan for fiscal year 2016. The wrong information. You know, some of our forecast optimism is based on the fact that all of our reps have high cloud scores. And using only historical information, this is almost a cliche in sales. Well, we just take the previous year's results, we multiply by 1 1/4, and boom, that's next year's goal. So I'll leave you with some final thoughts as a wrap-up here. First, the concerns and considerations you have about risk have to be sound, or the numbers that you develop don't matter. The numbers that you use have to be right, or the results that you get from those numbers don't matter. And third, the results have to be right, or the alternatives that you have to consider don't matter. And with that, I would like to thank you most of all for your time. And I sincerely hope that you've gained value from today's program. And as always, I encourage you, wherever you are, whether it's here or elsewhere, to question the answers. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.
You know, Andy, this is you touched on some really powerful subjects, and I think that there's probably a lot of nodding heads in the audience when you flashed up the quotes page, right? It seems like what we worked through in this presentation is really the categorization or the contextualization of the risk factors, right, as a kind of start, where you get away from averages and you move to best, worst, and most likely outcomes.
Well, that's right. Averaging is something that we're all very fluent in, and we're comfortable with it. I think there's a predecessor to that, which is really setting the foundation for having the conversation to begin with. And I know this quite personally from being in so many sales environments. There's almost an overriding attitude. I don't want to hear how you're not going to sell. I want to hear how you are going to sell. And so I've sat in many meetings where salespeople have brought up issues and items that are just, if you were good at what you do, you wouldn't, a cruddy product wouldn't be a problem. Or the amount of time that you spend is really directly correlated with the sales results you get, things like that. So what happens is people, over time, salespeople are actually discouraged to bring up artifacts that they get out in the field. And I think this is really harmful to companies because there's a lot of knowledge that just doesn't get brought back in because people just say, well, they're not going to change anything anyway.
How do you think that companies should go about creating the environment to facilitate that open and honest discussion? Again, as you said in part of your presentation, it's not making excuses, right? But it's actually talking almost like adults would be about these factors that influence everyone's day-to-day jobs.
Yeah, that's a very difficult thing to do. I think that one of the challenges is that sometimes with some people and some sales reps, it actually is making excuses and it is whining. And the way I differentiate it is, whining is continually bringing up issues and challenges that can't be changed. They've been addressed or they've been acknowledged. There are actions in place to address them and manage them, and they're just brought up over and over and over again. And that's whining. And what happens is it becomes that anything that's brought up as a selling, what's considered a sales impediment, is just lumped into that category. So I think to answer your question, what companies have to do is, and in particular sales VPs and sales managers, is they really have to be open-minded to listening. If the knee-jerk reaction is, all this ever is lame excuses, if my sales force was any good, they'd be able to sell. Well, salespeople are opportunistic like anyone else, and there's only so much beating your head against the wall that somebody is going to be able to put up with before they say, you know what, I could make a lot more money putting in the same amount of time somewhere else. So I think managers have to be aware of that and recognize that when people bring back selling challenges, they have to pay very close attention and then press the salesperson on, okay, what would be a way that you would recommend fixing that? How would you manage that? How would you fix that? How would you improve that? And then get that information up on the board. It doesn't mean that every problem can be fixed. It doesn't even mean that every problem is cost effective to fix. But you have to get the information out there. So it's a matter of being open-minded to hearing it in the first place.
Yeah, that's great advice right there. So we have a question from the audience. And that is, why do you think companies still rely on multiples for their forecast? In essence, I need 5x my quota to succeed, and yet there's rarely any solid evidence to back this up whatsoever.
Well, the short answer is it's very easy. Multiplication is very easy, and putting rigor behind it is hard. And so it's a very important consideration, because when I look at 5x plan to have in a pipeline, for example, there's a cost to that, and there's a marketing cost. So then you start to put your sales funnel back up on the board, and you say, okay, to achieve a 5x funnel, I have to spend X amount on early stage lead generation and on outbound marketing just to pull prospects into the top of the funnel. So
for what it's worth, and coming from a marketing side of the fence, those numbers always get thrown up on the board, and I've yet to be in a company that actually increases marketing budget 5x to get those same results.
Yeah. There's rarely a. I mean, those numbers typically don't flow in any congruent way. So they'll say to the sales force, yeah, you have to have a 5x multiplier in your pipeline, and then you say, okay, well, what are we doing about the marketing lead gen that's going to help fulfill that? And then it's, well, no, we're cutting marketing's budget. We're not we're not going to do any more with that. So then it becomes, well, when you analyze things in this way, and there's other methodologies too, but then you start to look at it and say, well, then okay, 5x. If the risk is out there that dictates that, we're looking at that level of volatility in whatever those key variables are, then you have to say, well, what does that 5x cost? Because 3x could be just as effective, or even less. And so, yeah, I always look for the derivation of those multipliers. It doesn't necessarily mean straight out of the gate they're wrong. It's just if there's no real background behind it, if it's a swag, then you can usually uncover that pretty quickly, because it's like, well, that's the number we always use.
Yeah, habit and inertia are powerful modes of behavior. But one of the things that's really interesting, and this was a personal takeaway from your presentation that I was making mental notes on, is it really is, or it seems to be, much more effective to contextualize, again, that best, worst, and most likely, because, again, that gets away from this, well, why 5x? Why 3x? What's the right number? If you could live in that realm between best case scenario and identify what that is and really get everyone on the same page, and even then the most likely, and be aware of what that worst case scenario might look like, seems to me that those conversations then are highly contextualized, and you can really get to execution much faster.
Well, that's right. You have to have an understanding with the extreme ends of whatever process it is that you're talking about, because many of these conversations tend to be like what I call Pollyanna. So you can say, well, we just have this crackerjack marketing team, and they're really hot on the lead gen part of it, and nobody ever actually gets down to the numbers and say, well, okay, well, how many leads come in that have a score of X or higher, or have these qualities, and actually get numbers behind it, and then start to look at it and say, well, what could improve that? And given that it can be improved, what would be the magnitude or the amount of that improvement? And in part B of this, what you can look at is you can say, well, say a 5% improvement in marketing lead gen will have an 8% improvement in sales revenue, and then you can even map it out to the net profit. The net profit. So in other words, since a lot of companies talk about ROI, I mean, you can look at these variables and say, well, which one of these, if we change it or improve it somewhat, will have the biggest, essentially the biggest bang for the buck. That really helps to ferret out some of those what I call pie in the sky programs and say, oh boy, if we just got into the social media campaign where we gave this free offer and so on and so forth, then you can actually predictively model it out and say, well, here's the impact that we see in revenue. We're going to spend $100,000 and it's going to give us a $40,000 improvement maybe in revenue. That to me would be a bad investment.
Indeed. Well, it's funny. Oftentimes, that's where I do see the multipliers living in the companies that I've worked for, which is to say, if you look at certain activities, especially those that are working, doing more of those activities or more of those campaigns, more of that kind of marketing-focused attention, those programs within your marketing mix that are already proven successful are oftentimes where the multipliers live when you keep essentially playing to your strengths, to put it, very bluntly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I think one of the challenges, though, and we all talk about change and how things are changing faster than ever. Sometimes you look at those past successes and you just extrapolate that out, and you say, well, if we did this campaign and we got a 20% improvement in revenue, that we should continue on that trajectory. But what's important is to look at the other variables in the market and say, yeah, but what if competitor introduces a cloud-based solution that's 30% less, costs 30% less than our solution today? What sort of pricing pressure is that going to put on us next year? And then you can have that discussion, and you can say, well, our prices are what we're going to be able to get in selling this product is probably going to be less. So how would that model out? What would we see? And of course, one of the challenges many times is we don't know exactly when that competitor is going to have that product market ready. We're thinking it's third quarter next year. But we don't know for sure. So really, planning has a lot to do with it, and just looking at the road ahead and seeing where those potholes might be, and then figuring out, well, what would be the most effective thing to change right now to be ready for that possibility.
Yeah, I think this is actually an area that a lot of marketers are really familiar with, and the example that I would use is less on competitors and their responses, and more towards, especially in an advertising realm, when prices rise due to things like an auction or other kind of network effects, so to speak. The people that discovered success with Facebook advertising 3 years ago when it was debuted, and it was really cost effective to acquire new customers, are now finding that those costs have risen dramatically, and all of their equations have changed. Same goes for Google AdWords when kind of it first came out, and this is kind of the tail of the tape with a lot of kind of customer acquisition programs when they first start versus a few years in.
That's right, and your concerns and considerations change as well. So sometimes when you're talking about revenue growth, some of that you may have to think about, well, how much of that is going to come from new account acquisition versus growth, revenue growth in existing accounts, versus in the case of subscription accounts, I know some companies have a big what they call customer reclamation program where they want to pick up or bring back lapsed customers. And so those considerations have to be brought in constantly, because the revenue strategies may change, or they should always be up for consideration as companies move forward.
Absolutely. We have actually kind of a fun question here from the audience. What is the meaning of contrary domino?
Well, I have two answers for that. It's the genesis of it was I was out with my family, and we were sitting in a restaurant, and the kids were little, and there was I have two kids, but there was three kids on that booth in the restaurant, and the one in the middle was getting pushed to both sides, and somebody said, Alex is like a contrary domino in the middle of these other two, and as soon as I heard that, I said, oh my gosh, that's a great name. So it started out as the name of my blog, and then I kept it as the name of my company. But I think it really is as far as its messages about what customers have to do in selling. Sales is changing momentum in many cases, and it's coming up with an idea that's different than what the status quo is, and so it's really a statement of what my customers have to do. They've got to help go another way, or help companies go another way, and so that's the story behind it.
Andy, this has been a great hour. We're bumping up here on our time limits and being respectful of keeping our webinar series to 1 hour straight. I want to thank you for your participation, your great insights. This presentation, for my money, was really worth the time to invest, and hopefully we'll get a lot of shares and people picking this up. This will be made available as a video recording for those out in the audience, so you can share it amongst your colleagues and friends. We will probably also likely put this up on SlideShare and send out a number of communications via social media following this webinar. So once again, thanks, Andy.
Okay, and thank you, Eric. I really enjoyed it, and again, I hope it